Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the CIL e-conference on COVID-19 and international shipping. This event will last approximately 90 minutes, including a Q&A with the audience. Throughout the event, we invite you to ask questions to the panel via the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. But first, please allow me to introduce our distinguished moderator for today's session, Professor Tommy Koh, Ambassador at Large at the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Chairman of the Center for International Law. Of course, Professor Tommy Koh needs no introduction, but for those of you who might not know, Professor Koh was the president of the Third United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, and he also chaired the preparatory committee and the main committee at the Earth Summit. He was Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations and ambassador to the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor, I now hand the floor to you.
On behalf of the Center for International Law of the National University of Singapore, I extend a warm welcome to all the participants. This is the 7th in a series of webinars on COVID-19 and the international legal order. The webinar today focuses on COVID-19 and international shipping. International shipping is vital to the world economy and to global prosperity. It has been estimated that between 80 to 90% of the global trade in goods is seaborne. We therefore need the ports to remain open and the ships to continue to sail in order to ensure the steady flow of food and other essential goods such as medical products. It is not an exaggeration for me to say that without international shipping, there will be no international trade. The UN specialized agency in charge of international shipping is the International Maritime Organization. It is headquartered in London. The IMO's mandate is to promote safe, secure, environmentally sound, efficient, and sustainable shipping. The IMO is a blue chip organization. The current Secretary General of IMO is Mr. Kitak Lim of South Korea. His immediate predecessor, Dr. Koji Sekimizu, is with us today. The next question I want to ask is, what laws governing international shipping? International shipping is governed by international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It is also governed by the approximately 60 legal instruments emanating from IMO. The two most famous IMO conventions are: one, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, and two, the Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution, or MAPO. We have a very distinguished panel for this webinar. I will introduce them one at a time. Our first speaker is my good friend, Dr. Koji Sekimizu, the Secretary General Emeritus of IMO. He's also the Chancellor Emeritus of the World Maritime University. Koji, as I call him, was born in Yokohama, which was Japan's first international port. He joined the IMO in 1989 and served in various senior positions until 2011, when he was elected as the 8th Secretary General of IMO. He retired in 2015 in order to take care of his wife. He is greatly respected all over the world, including in Singapore. the Singapore government has conferred on him the Public Service Star. He is an adjunct senior fellow of the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU. He's a senior advisor to the Maritime and Port Authorities Academy. It gives me great pleasure to invite Koji-san to speak to us.
Thank you, Professor Quah. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It is a really great pleasure for me to join in this webinar. But before I say anything more, I'd like to place just a disclaimer that I am participating in this webinar only in my personal capacity, and my statement and messages should not be considered as necessarily reflecting those of any government or organization, including IM. However, I, as an individual living in this globalized world, would like to clearly state here my appreciations to hundreds of thousands of seafarers and port personnel continuously working for international shipping to maintain global supply chain, even in this very difficult time of COVID-19 pandemic. I would also like to state my firm view that the global problems can only be resolved through international cooperation, and that international cooperation on matters of international shipping must be done at IMO in cooperation with other UN agencies such as ILO and WHO. I would further like to state that cooperation among governments and the shipping industry is particularly important, and the meetings of IMO committees should resume or reopen as soon as possible, employing new ways of communication using the latest information and communication technologies. I'm very pleased to see IMO's responses to the outbreak and pandemic of COVID-19 so far, reflected at the home pages of IMO, providing useful precautions, advices, guidelines, and recommendations. And most recently, the joint statement of ICAO, IMO, and ILO on facilitation of crew changes through various circular letters. Professor Quah, within 10 minutes available, short time, I just want to cover probably 4 things. The first thing is the need for a new law to provide medical care at port. Professor Quah, you raised a very good and important question in our preparatory session, whether we need new law to oblige a port to provide medical care to sick passengers and seafarers. In short, my answer is yes. From the humanitarian point of view, sick passengers and crew must be provided with necessary medical care and treatment at port. In the coming period of COVID-19 pandemic, to live with the virus until effective vaccine and medicines would be found, thousands of seafarers could be infected somewhere and many get sick on board. We must take action now, and I have 3 suggestions. The first of all, IMO Secretariat should take action now to raise this issue and request member governments to strengthen their medical care capacity at their ports to provide the necessary medical care to those sick people at port. Second, the law of the sea community at the United Nations should take action to start the process of consideration for specific amendments to UNCLOS to include possibly a new article in the convention, provision of medical care to seafarers and passengers by port is a matter of general nature and a humanitarian requirement. And in my view, it is appropriate to include a basic law in UNCLOS. And third, IMO member governments should also take action to amend the SOLAS Convention to include new regulation for ports to provide medical care to passengers and seafarers. This could be done by including a new chapter in the SOLAS Convention for special measures to deal with onboard outbreak of infectious diseases and care for passengers and seafarers. This is the first point. The second point is the need for best management practice for large cruise passenger ships. This point was raised by Professor Beckman when we had a preliminary discussion. He raised a question whether we need international guidelines for large cruise passenger ships in a case of infectious disease outbreak. Since the outbreak of COVID-19 in the beginning of this year, a number of large cruise passenger ships encountered very difficult situations. Diamond Princess is one of them. After a passenger disembarked at Hong Kong was confirmed positive for infection, the passenger ship was accepted at the port of Yokohama, and the crew and passengers were quarantined and isolated on board for nearly 2 weeks. Among 3,700 passengers and crew on board, 741 people were infected, that is 20%, during the cruise navigation period of just 2 weeks. Chartered flights were arranged for many passengers to be sent back home, and the Japanese government encountered many difficulties, including communications and consultations with the shipmaster, the operating company in the United States, the flag states, and the lack of international guidelines or agreement resulted in a sort of a statement of government officials, such as, when pandemic was over, investigation should be carried out on the need of international arrangements to deal with such incidents, and what kind of contingency response should be applied have to be found out. And in my view, that sort of question should be raised at IMO. UNCLOS provides basic international law such as provisions of the legal status of the territorial sea and the right of innocent passage. But UNCLOS does not provide any provisions regarding ships staying in internal waters and ports, and in my view, creating a vacuum of international law. This area of vacuum of international law has been filled largely by international conventions adopted by IMO, such as SOLAS, STCW, and MARPOL, covering a wide range of operation of ships engaged in international trade. That was already mentioned by Professor. The cruise industry has been seriously affected by COVID-19 pandemic and forced to voluntarily suspend their worldwide operation. However, the economic stakes are high and industry should be looking forward to returning back to the business. But our acute problem for the cruise industry will be to find out proper answer to the serious question of how the business of ocean cruise onboard large passenger ships could be reopened with continuous needs of social preventive measures, such as social distancing, avoid close contact in enclosed spaces, and application of hygiene, and etc. There is no international standards available for operations of the cruise ships responding to this crisis. And therefore, it is essential, in my view, for the cruise industry to consider establishing common best management practices, and such industry practices must be endorsed by IMO member government. Furthermore, international guidelines for the outbreak of serious infectious diseases should be established as soon as possible at IMO, involving appropriate mechanism of adoption. I recall that in order to fight against Somali piracy, the shipping industry associations established the best management practice, and the best management practice was generally accepted by member government, and international standards for armed security guards are discussed at the Maritime Safety Committee, and a number of international measures were adopted. International cooperation among government and industry members is crucial for the cruise industry to survive in the remaining period of pandemic and beyond, and the cruise industry associations must take a lead for international development. So this is the second issue, and the remaining time, I hope I have time. The third point is the need for reopening IMO meetings. In my view, governments and international organizations should seriously consider the needs of adopting formal guidelines. I stress formal guidelines for various procedures in the maritime and port activities to deal with the risk of resurgence of COVID-19 and future cases of outbreak of infectious diseases. In order to do this, IMO, together with other UN agencies, should consider and invent new ways of discussions and meetings for consideration of international measures without holding traditional physical meetings, so that committees of the organization could resume as soon as possible. So this is the third point. And finally, when it comes regarding to facilitate crew changes, I appreciate shipping industry has prepared a set of guidelines and recommendations for government, and that has been already circulated. But I think the IMO member government will have to take formal action to endorse those guidelines and recommendations as a sort of agreement among government. So those are the 4 points I have raised, and you may have a number of other questions, and it will be my pleasure to respond later at the question and answer session. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Koji-san. On your last point, perhaps the IMO can emulate the example of WHO and hold meetings by Zoom. WHO recently held a General Assembly by Zoom, and it was done in a reasonable way. I will now introduce the second speaker. The second speaker is Hoon, the CEO of the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore. She is also a good friend. We were members of the Singapore team, which negotiated the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. Hoon's academic credentials are formidable. She has a degree in psychology from Australia, a degree in economics from France, and an MBA from Switzerland. I would say that she is the first woman to be appointed to her current job, and we are all very proud of her. The Port of Singapore is one of the busiest in the world. Singapore is also, the Singapore Ship Registry is also the 5th largest registry in the world. Singapore is therefore both an important port state and an important fact state. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Hoon to speak to us.
Good afternoon, Professor Quah. Thank you so much for the introduction. I would like to also thank the Center for International Law for bringing us together today to discuss this very important issue of COVID-19 and its implication to the shipping. Koji-san's speech earlier has given us much food for thought. When I came into MPA, and this year for the work plan for my team was really on 3 Ds. The first, digitalization, decarbonization, and disruption. I had never expected, or my entire team didn't expect, that disruption itself has come in the form of a global COVID-19 pandemic. I have some slides which I will ask the organizer to help. I wanted to talk a little bit about the new normal. As Professor Ko has mentioned earlier, over 80% of the world's trade is carried by sea. Ports definitely must stay open so that essential supplies can get to where they're urgently needed to fight the virus and for the survival. And ports must operate 24/7. In terms of the trends, can I go to the next slide? I wanted to map up some of the trends that we are seeing. First of all, we expect the pandemic to drag the world into a recession. Now, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, projects the global economy to contract by 3% in 2020, which is a sharp downward revision from its earlier forecast of 3.3% expansion. We expect production and consumption to be scaled back around the world, although it depends on how the demand rebounds back. But the World Trade Organization expects global trade to fall by between 13% to 32% in 2020. Post-pandemic, we also expect trade patterns to shift. We might see an increase in intra-regional volumes, shorter supply chain. Some experts have commented that the demand for smaller vessels on short sea routes might increase, and that the demand for very large container ships could fall. Now, the pandemic situation will remain fluid, and it will have profound impact still waiting to be seen. There's much we do not know yet, but we do know that the new normal will be shaped by the intersection or even the dilemma of many governments over the concerns of lives to minimize spread and livelihoods, economy and job. Next slide. So what could we do collectively as governments and industry? And I would like to share 3 approaches here. The first, international leadership and cooperation. Second, to further accelerate digitalization and automation. And third, to partner business. And key is to transform the maritime workforce. Next. Koji-san earlier mentioned that international leadership and cooperation are vital in tackling transboundary issues such as the COVID-19. We cannot agree more. The fight against such pandemic can only be won through our collective efforts because no one is safe unless everyone is safe. So even during these difficult times, we must not forget that there is still the open and rules-based system that international shipping can strive on. And it will take global leadership to preserve and advance this system rather than cave into protectionist tendencies in the new normal. So IMO's leadership will be critical today to rally the industry together. At the start of the pandemic, IMO sprung into action, working with member states and the industries, both ports and shipping, and other organizations, including IAPH, ICS, where Simon is represented here, to minimize disruption to shipping, support the continuation of global supply chain. They have also issued a few statements working together with the industry associations. And we know, because yesterday I was in the same panel as SecGen Mr. Kitak Lim on the United Nations Global Compact, where he talked about the Secretary is actively looking at resuming its meeting as soon as practicable. Another topic that's high in the agenda is on crew change. Now, MPA recognizes that seafarers play an important role in keeping the global trade going. As with all modes of travel, crew change will not be able to be carried out in the same way as it's done before COVID-19. And therefore, we have been working very closely with the industry players and stakeholders to develop protocols and procedures which will allow crew change to be carried out in a controlled and regulated environment. to minimize risk of public health to the country as well as to the shipping community when crew change is taking place. So in a way, we have established a sort of a SOP or a protocol, which we call a crew change safe corridor. Another key action which MPA has taken is to allow crew change to take place in Singapore under special circumstances, and that takes place since March. And most recently, we expanded the circumstances for crew change, taking into account industry feedback. For example, crew members who have completed their employment contract are now allowed to do their crew change in Singapore, on top of allowing them on compassionate and medical grounds. For all medical cases, MPA has allowed crew change and for them to be attended to medical care. However, we are not stopping there. I'm pleased to say that the Singapore Shipping Association has also taken the lead to not only look at feasible creative solutions, for example, chartering dedicated flights to facilitate ship-to-plane arrangements, or putting in place a floating holding facilities to hold the crew. They have also most recently, yesterday, in fact, they just launched a handbook on crew change procedures in Singapore, which could serve as a reference for all the industry players. I'll now go to the next priority for international leadership. That is the global supply chain connectivity. In this regard, Singapore worked with 174 other UN member states on the joint statement on supply chain connectivity to underscore the global community's resolve to keep global supply chain going. MPA, we also initiated the Port Authorities Roundtable Declaration. Pleased to say that we have 57 ports coming on board on an open declaration to commit to keep our ports open and to minimize disruptions to the global supply chain. We have held 2 video conferencing where we shared our practices and our experiences and the measures we put in place, and it has been insightful, motivating each other on. Next. The next key pillar is really looking at accelerating digitalization. I noticed that ICF together with BIMCO and a few other organizations at IAPH has issued a statement yesterday to call for issuing a call of action to accelerate digitalization. Indeed, in these times, we actually see an acceleration of digitalization during this period, as this webinar is one example. And that will be part of the new normal. It will be about business activities going in a more efficient and effective manner. As you can see in the slide, Digital Port at SG is one of our initiatives which we have launched for port-related clearance. And fortunately, we launched that a few months ago, and it has now been well received by the industry. During this period, more than 500 shipping companies could go to this portal and get a one-stop clearance for our port to come into our port. MPA will also work with like-minded stakeholders. We are thinking of expanding this concept into a global network to create a seamless cross-border digital network where different systems can be linked up, interoperability, and interoperate with each other seamlessly, which we call the digital oceans. Further, there are 2 other initiatives we are looking at besides digitalization. Is also about automation. Ship-to-shore delivery via drones. We have done a trial and it has been successful. So we'll be looking at expanding it further with our industry players. Another initiative is actually a telemedical consultation with seafarers. So you no longer need to have just a physical consultation, which may take time, but a telemedical consultation. There's even one technology which I was being introduced to about being able to also have an overview of the medical conditions or the various symptoms of seafarers offshore. Next. Next is already about partnering businesses to transform the maritime workforce. And that's important. And we think that this is a very good opportunity for our workforce to be transformed. Besides the 4 national packages, resilience, solidarity, unity, and fortitude packages, which our Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Heng Swee Keat, has announced, MPA also announced the Maritime Singapore Together package, which amounts to 27 million Singapore dollar to help companies and individuals, in particular to develop our people in the industry and prepare them to seize this opportunity. But with each crisis, next slide please. With each crisis, it comes an opportunity, as what we see in this word, weighty. Shipping is a very resilient industry. It has gone through many recessions. In fact, when we first transited to IMO 2020 earlier this year, many of us thought that it is our greatest challenge of the decade. Little did we know that COVID-19 has come along. But being a resilient industry and being the backbone of global trade, I'm confident and I'm sure that our industry will emerge stronger from this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hoon, for your statement. I will now introduce our third speaker. He is Mr. Simon Bennett, the Deputy Secretary General of the International Chamber of Shipping, ICS. ICS is the world's most important trade association for ship operators. In other words, it is the voice of the shipping industry. Simon has worked for ICS for 30 years. He's currently the secretary to the ICS Board of Directors, and in that role, he helps the board to determine and develop its priorities. One of his very important assignments is that he's leading the shipping industry's response to the challenge of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I now invite Simon to speak.
Thank you very much indeed, and greetings from London, which sadly I understand is now officially the COVID capital of the world. But I really am grateful for this chance to present the views of the International Chamber of Shipping. As you said, we are the Global Trade Association for Ship Operators, representing the global industry with our global regulators, in particular the IMO. I should explain our members comprise the world's national ship owners associations, and that of course includes the Singapore Shipping Association. And our mantra really, which I think can't really be repeated too often, particularly at the moment, is that we are a global industry requiring global rules. Otherwise, we have chaos leading to economic inefficiency and market distortion. So hopefully my comments will complement rather than duplicate what we've already heard from our two previous very eminent speakers. So I'll quickly try to summarize some of the operational challenges presented by COVID-19, including the disruption to the normal functioning of the legal framework that we normally take for granted. I'll then quickly look to the future at this moment when I think it's fair to say we are really only at the start of this terrible pandemic and we're still very far from the end. In very general terms, I think there is good news to report in that for the most part, maritime trade has continued to move. Leaving aside the special challenges experienced by passenger ships, which Koji-san referred to, the majority of the world's ports have remained open to visiting ships and for the loading and discharge of cargo. We are in a different place to aviation, and while demand for maritime services has clearly been affected by the lockdown in many national economies, broadly speaking, maritime trade has continued to flow, and with encouragement from ICS and our member national associations, actually the G20 governments at their emergency summits in March, they moved fairly quickly to establish that the movement of maritime trade should remain an absolute priority. That said, the industry has faced three really difficult operational challenges. Firstly, there's been the ability to conduct statutory surveys and inspections, and for ships to be issued with all the required certification to allow them to continue to trade. There's also been the reluctance of some ports and other services, such as pilots, to adhere to necessary health protocols to ensure that seafarers have been sufficiently protected from infection. And then, as we've already heard referred to, what's really still the most pressing challenge of all, and it's still not been fully resolved, and that's the ability of ships to conduct crew changes. And there are still about 150,000 seafarers worldwide who have already spent many extra months at sea and who urgently need to be repatriated to their home countries. Because apart from the obvious humanitarian need for seafarers to be reunited with their families, there really is an increasing danger of crew fatigue leading to serious maritime accidents. And we've now really reached a point where tours of duty can no longer be extended indefinitely. And we're very much looking to the Singapore MPA working with the local authorities to take a lead here, because we believe what happens in Singapore, because Singapore is so important, will have big implications for what happens globally. So notwithstanding the legitimate need to protect local populations from infection, the fact remains that many governments around the world have chosen to ignore their continuing obligations, and they already exist under IMO and ILO conventions, with respect to protection of safety of life at sea and the welfare of ships' crews, by their unwillingness to facilitate the movement and changeover of ships' crews. And this also includes cases, as Koji-san mentioned, where there have been serious medical emergencies, where despite clear obligations under existing international conventions, the international health regulations, ILO Maritime Law Convention, Labour Convention, very sick seafarers have been denied access to medical treatment ashore. And really these challenges, they've been compounded by the reality that our leading global regulator, the IMO, has had to suspend its meetings. Whilst in the midst of the COVID emergency, the actions of national and local health authorities have understandably often had to take precedence over the requirements of global maritime regulation. So it's been something of an uphill struggle to make senior policymakers and national health authorities aware of the wider implications of their actions for the movement of maritime trade. With regard to the problem of conducting ship surveys and certification, most flag states have, including Singapore, most flag states have so far shown a pragmatic approach and a willingness to grant extensions. And most of the world's port state control regimes, which also have a responsibility for enforcement, they've also largely agreed a similarly pragmatic approach. The difficulty, though, is that as the pandemic continues, further extensions to certification may be required beyond what is strictly permitted by the relevant IMO conventions. And the requirements of the Ballast Water Management Convention for existing ships to install new treatment systems is a particular case in point. And hopefully a solution can be found by the current session of the IMO Council, which is meeting in correspondence. I mentioned that our challenges have been complicated by the necessary suspension of IMO meetings, which means member states are unable to formally agree solutions. But with the support of the current IMO Secretary General, the industry has tried to fill the vacuum. And as we've heard, an example has been the development of the recommended framework of protocols, which IMO agreed to circulate to all IMO member states for the conduct of crew changes, which the industry led by ICS actually produced in a matter of weeks to provide a framework through which governments and local health authorities could permit crew changes to be effected safely and with minimal risk of spreading infection amongst their national populations. Now, these protocols are only a framework to be adjusted by national governments like Singapore, according to the circumstances that prevail locally. We've been pleased by the extent they are starting to gain traction in important ports like Singapore, but the situation, frankly, is still far from perfect, and a huge number of crew changes really do now need to take place urgently. So we urge the MPA to do everything it can, because what happens in Singapore is really pivotal to how other administrations around the world respond. Quickly, looking to the future, it's clearly in the industry's interest that normal IMO meetings can resume as soon as possible. And in our own submissions to the IMO Council, we've made it clear that IMO keeps on track with the implementation of the strategy for reducing CO2 emissions from shipping. And the greatest long-term threat, frankly, to the authority of IMO will be the possibility that others, including the European Union, try to fill any vacuum with regional measures, such as the EU's current proposal to include international shipping within the scope of the EU emissions trading system. But we're confident that the IMO Marine Environment Protection Committee can reconvene in the autumn in some form or another, so that governments can reach agreement on a package of new regulatory measures which should ensure that the ambitious CO2 targets which IMO has already agreed will indeed be met. Now, really, I would have liked to conclude on a note of optimism, and assuming we can soon get through the worst of the current emergency. Unfortunately, there are still some dark clouds on the horizon which were really forming before the crisis began. And by this, I mean the threat to the maintenance of a rules-based global trading system, which frankly is presented by the attitude of the government of the United States, with its hostility to multilateralism, the role of the WTO, and also its ongoing dispute with China. So in short, there's a real possibility that controversies surrounding responses to COVID-19 are going to exacerbate these tensions. I am confident that most of the world's governments continue to understand the importance of maintaining the authority of institutions such as IMO. That said, COVID-19 and the issues such as the crew change crisis, I think they all demonstrate that many of those things that we normally take for granted, such as adherence by governments to global maritime rules, can easily be placed under strain. So I think there is going to be an important need for the maritime community to be especially vigilant when we eventually emerge into the post-COVID world. I apologise if I spoke too long, but I hope that was of interest to you all.
Thank you, Simon. That was very good. Very good. I'm very pleased to hear from Simon that the shipping industry had not been as badly affected by the pandemic as the aviation industry. I also note that ICS has submitted a proposed protocol to IMO on the rotation of seafarers. I'll come back to this later. I want to introduce our fourth speaker, Professor Robert Beckman. Bob is also an old and good friend. I regard him as one of the world's leading authorities on the law of the sea. He's my personal guru on the Straits of Malacca and Singapore and the South China Sea. Bob was the founding director of the Center for International Law, and he's currently the head of the Center's program on ocean law and policy. I'm not going to ask Bob to speak, but I requested him to sum up the discussion later. But I would like Bob to participate actively in the discussion. I want to go on to the Q&A session now. And I want to begin with some questions that I would like to pose to the panel. the first question is whether or not we need a new law or rule or protocol which will oblige a port to allow a ship with sick passengers or crew to dock in order to seek medical help. At the moment, ports are under no such obligation. If we don't change the law, then we must accept the fact that some ships with sick passengers or crew will become floating coffins. Koji has made some comments on this. I wonder if Hoon, Simon, and Bob would like to add to Koji's comments.
Prof, maybe I can go, then Simon go next. There's actually currently the Maritime Labour Convention, which regulates and protects the seafarer welfare and their rights to a safe and secure workplace. It does state there that seafarers in need of immediate medical care are given access to medical facilities on shore. It is therefore the responsibility of member states to implement their obligations. The challenge for individual states would be, I guess, really about how it meets up with their national immigration policies. Nonetheless, for all member states who have signed on to the Maritime Labour Convention, Singapore included, we have been tending to all seafarers or requests that needed medical care, not just physical medical care, even some who came to tell us to say that they're under strenuous condition. If the doctor were to certify that they cannot continue to work safely on board, we would activate the crew change for them. So that's what, as Singapore, as a member of the Maritime Labour Convention, have done, at least in the past few months, and we will continue to do that for medically certified unfit seafarers to continue to work on board.
I'd like to respond to Hoon, please. The convention you referred to is an ILO convention, am I right? Yeah. So it is binding on states that have acceded to the convention. I wonder whether, do we need a similar provision in SOLAS, or there's no need to duplicate this law? And my second question to Hoon is that there was an Italian cruise ship called Costa Fortuna, and this ship was turned away by ports in Thailand and Malaysia. Singapore allowed Costa Fortuna to dock. So could you tell us something about what happened when the ship docked in Singapore? And why was this privilege extended only to Costa Fortuna and not to other cruise ships?
Professor, I'll take the second question first. Costa Fortuna was a passenger cruise ship. Prior to 13th March, all scheduled cruise ships are allowed to call on Singapore to embark and disembark their passengers. So our cruise terminal is still open for cruisers to come in. And Costa Fortuna was actually one such home-ported cruise. All their passengers actually boarded the cruise in Singapore. They went for a round trip. Yes, there's been stories, there's been news about two countries which didn't allow them to disembark the passengers for holidays, for one day, one-day excursion on their land. But they were making their return trip back to Singapore, and it would be irresponsible for us not to allow them to disembark. However, after March, with assessment among the various government agencies, the Singapore government, we took a policy call not to take any more cruise ships to embark and disembark passengers in Singapore. And that took effect on 13 March. And the cruise companies were duly informed, so they were able to make their plans. And we also noticed that during that period, because there were a lot of cancellation, many of the cruise companies actually also cancelled their cruises following this pandemic in this part of the world. On your first question on SOLAS, my understanding is that it may not be totally relevant for it. There are we are a party of both SOLAS and the Maritime Labour Convention. If a similar regulation were to be included in the SOLA, I mean, Singapore will have no issue about it. But perhaps the way forward, given that there's already a clause in the Maritime Labour Convention, is to encourage as many member states to ratify the MLC, and actually more importantly, is to encourage existing parties to ensure they implement their obligation. And I said earlier, for all governments or port authorities, there will be national circumstances you need to to take into consideration, including your health ministry, immigration policy as well. But having said that, it is an international convention. If we were to subscribe to Maritime Labour Convention, then we should try to respect the obligation, irrespective of whether it's in ILO or IMO. Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment. The ILO convention only applies to seafarers. It doesn't apply to passengers. So there is still a gap, you know. If a ship has sick passengers, it's a health emergency. Can the port say to the ship, please don't come to my port? Or should ports, for humanitarian reasons, be willing to allow the ships to dock and to render medical help to the sick passengers? I think so. Let me go on and ask Simon and Bob, and then come back to Koji and you. Simon, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's certainly a place to relook at this issue and whether we do need it made absolutely clear what the obligations of states are. The real problem is implementation. Actually, as we've heard, there are already many existing international instruments apart from the ILO Maritime Labour Convention. I think in very broad terms, many IMO conventions make it clear what the obligations of states are with regard to medical assistance to seafarers. And we also have the WHO international health regulations. In fairness to governments, these regulations, they weren't designed for the extraordinary circumstances we have at the moment with a global pandemic. So that's where I suggest I don't think with something that's going to be easy to do immediately, but in the aftermath, I think it might be a useful exercise to see if any of these instruments can be strengthened so that it's absolutely clear what the situation is if and when, hopefully never, we have a similar situation in the future. But the real problem actually is that the regulations and the obligations of member states, of governments, are quite clear. The difficulty, and that includes in Singapore, I mean, MPA have been trying very hard to make the case on behalf of the industry. The difficulty is they have to negotiate with the health authorities, and the health authorities are always going to set what they perceive to be the protecting the health of their local populations over the concerns of others who they don't immediately understand. So I think the immediate issue is what maritime authorities can do to explain to national health authorities, immigration authorities, why it's so important that they do show flexibility, particularly with regard to emergency medical evacuations, but also with equally serious issues such as the crew change crisis that we face at the moment.
Tommy, if I could make a point, I think following up from what Simon has said, I think what we see here is perhaps a lack of interagency coordination. A pandemic of this type requires coordination among various agencies at the international institution level. It's not purely an IMO issue. It's an IMO working with the International Labour Organization and the MLC, as well as with the WHO. So we need protocols in which perhaps the lead agency at the international level should be IMO, but they should be working very closely, not only with the other international institutions, but with the shipping organizations such as ICS and the others to work out a protocol. At the national level, again, the same organizations have to be working with port states through port state control organization or groups, and also I think the shots are called when there's a pandemic of this type by your health authorities and your immigration authorities. The transport ministry is probably lower down the line when the number one priority of the country is to protect the health of their own people. So again, I think at the national level, there has to be emergency preparedness and response to know how to deal with a pandemic of this sort, and to give the maritime administrations and even the transport in terms of air traffic, because very often, even if the port will let the crew members come into port, for example, they have to fly home, right? The leading countries in the region for seafarers are the Philippines, India, and Indonesia. So even if you let them off the ship, they have to get home, and there may be a lockdown in their own country where they can fly into the home airport, but they can't get back to their own village. So it's a very complex question which requires interagency cooperation at international level, national level, but also cooperation with the shipping industry, because the ship owner or operator is the one that has to pay for the repatriation of the crew members at the end of their contracts.
I have a question for Bob. In his opening remarks, Koji said we may have to amend UNCLOS. Do you see any merit in this point?
Merit in the point, yes, but not possible. I think we can solve this problem without amending UNCLOS. UNCLOS is almost impossible to amend, as we're finding out now with the BB&J negotiations. We have 2 implementation agreements. We're trying to agree on a third, but we don't need to amend UNCLOS. Through the linkage between the Law of the Sea Convention and the IMO Convention, which member states must comply with the generally accepted international rules and regulations, procedures, and practices. There's enough of these terms of reference in UNCLOS to incorporate the IMO conventions into the obligations of states. So that's all we need. What we need is for the IMO to take the lead, working with industry, the WHO, and the ILO to make rules and protocols that are more clear. We have an emergency now in the same way we did after 9/11, when international shipping usually didn't deal with port states, they dealt with flag states. They didn't try to intrude on what ports did. 9/11 changed all that, and you have the ISPS code, which deals with port security. I think in the same way the international community can respond to a pandemic of this sort, and port states would be willing, so long as they believe they're consulted and the rules are reasonable, and they know who's going to pay. If there's going to be 200 passengers coming off a ship to a developing country that may not have the necessary medical facilities, even if you have them, you want to know who's going to foot the bill. So protocols have to be worked out. But I think it's possible, and the pandemic will give the issues the attention it needs.
Thank you, Bob. I would like to ask Koji whether he agreed. Koji, do you agree with Bob that what we need is for the IMO to work together with WHO and ILO, and there's no need to amend UNCLOS? Do you agree? And could you sum up what your answer is on this first point? Koji, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Professor Tomiko, your point on passenger is the right one. And ILO, we have a very great Maritime Labor Convention. I'm also supporting that to expand the number of signatories. But when it comes to a passenger, and I think this has to be covered somewhere. This is point number one. And another thing is whether the SOLAS is the right one or not. And the SOLAS is a convention to deal with the ship. And for years and years, their coverage is only ship. But that has been changed by 9/11. And we decided to expand the scope to cover the port facility. It is possible to expand the scope of coverage of SOLAS in that fashion. But in my view that at the end of this pandemic and when many things have been settled, and then I think IMO should have a very good opportunity to sum up all measures. Now, for example, and I can imagine that the training requirement for STCW convention, training requirement for seafarers should be, of course, carried out. In the history of IMO covered, first of all, safety, and expanded to cover environment, marine pollution, and expanded to cover air pollution. Now they are dealing with greenhouse gas. And 9/11 enforced IMO to cover port. And now we have encountered this global pandemic on outbreak of infectious diseases. And this poses IMO really a new challenge. And I agree with the Professor Beckman that IMO should be the central body to really understand the complexity of everything. And in my view, the good way forward is probably to prepare a sort of protocol or a new chapter. And the beauty of the SOLAS Convention is employing tacit acceptance procedures. The new chapter could be prepared and implemented within a couple of years. You don't need to carry on a long year process of ratification. And Bob also mentioned about impracticability of amending UNCLOS. I know that very much. It's very difficult. But starting, because UNCLOS has amending procedure, isn't it? Then whatever the difficulties, if it is necessary, I think the community should really think about. Well, if it may not be easy and may not be possible, but at least I think that sort of a vacuum should be closed sometime. That is my response.
Thank you, Koji, very much for your response. On amending UNCLOS, my advice is that it's politically not feasible. There will be no consensus to amend UNCLOS. But what we can do and has been done is to adopt new agreements to complement UNCLOS. This has been done on fishing, it's being done on the PBNJ, and if there's a need to adopt an agreement under UNCLOS to complement UNCLOS, this is the way to go. I think I take very seriously a point that on the health of seafarers, there is an ILO convention that applies. The gap is passengers. At the moment, if a ship has sick passengers, there's no rule that will oblige a port to allow the ship to enter and to seek help. I think this is obviously a gap that we need to look at as part of the post-pandemic lessons learned. So thank you, Koji. I want to go on to our next point which is the rotation of seafarers. I think Simon said in his opening remarks that every month, about 150,000 seafarers are rotated. Those have completed their journey, will leave the ship, they will either go home or they will join another ship. Many seafarers have been stuck during the pandemic. They are unable to disembark. And because aviation has been shut down, they are unable to go home. Simon said that ICS has submitted a protocol to IMO for its consideration. I want to go back to Simon and ask Simon if he could elaborate a little bit on what has ICS proposed to IMO. And I want to ask the other panelists to comment. Simon, please.
Thank you. To be clear, we haven't exactly made a proposal to IMO because IMO as an organisation doesn't exist in terms of its member states. So what we did as an industry, we produced some recommendations, and then IMO, with their good cooperation, then circulated them to member states. But what we were really trying to do was to suggest a framework, because there is no one size fits all solution for the crew change problem. Recognizing what we spoke about before, that we have to recognize the sensitivities of national health authorities and their need to take account of the existence of the circumstances that prevail locally. But in short, what we wanted to do was come up with a set of generic protocols that cover the entire crew change process. So from the seafarer leaving their place of residence, their home, to traveling to an airport, to arriving in another country, then joining their ship, and then in the other direction, disembarking their ship, going to an airport, and then traveling home. So we identified all of the different parts of that process and the measures that, on the one hand, shipping companies should be expected to take to ensure the mitigation, prevention of infection. But in return, if companies can demonstrate they've taken these measures, we would expect governments to then do everything possible to facilitate the crew change process. And our understanding is that these protocols have gained traction around the world. We don't expect governments to say, oh, we're just simply going to apply these protocols. It's a framework which they can then use to adapt to local circumstances, which is what I understand has happened in Singapore with the guidebook you issued yesterday. All I would say is that though in Singapore, and it's not just Singapore, Hong Kong, it's the same, although we appreciate the actions that have been taken to loosen some of the restrictions, there really is still more to be done. For example, at the moment, while it's possible to conduct crew changes in Singapore, there's a requirement, I understand, for the ship to remain at berth until the seafarers have departed. And that's actually quite problematic for a variety of reasons. I understand the Singapore MPA is trying to move one step at a time in consultation with the local shipping community. But this really comes back to what we were talking about before, about the need to produce the arguments to make the real decision makers, which are the health authorities, understand that this is a really important issue and that we can reconcile preventing infection coming from seafarers with the important need to allow them to embark or disembark from their ships and be repatriated. I'm gabbling a bit there, but I think that was the answer you were looking for.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Simon. Let me call on Lei Hoon. Lei Hoon, can you respond to Simon and to my question?
Yes. Ambassador, maybe before I go into crew change, I was just looking at the Q&A and I was brought to attention by Dr. Cleopatra Dumbia Henry, our good friend in the World Maritime University, that for person in distress at sea, there is actually the International Convention on Maritime Search and Rescue Obligation, where we need to provide medical advice and medical assistance or even medical evacuation. So there have been times, for example, even for passenger ships, if there is passengers in distress in the open sea, we have centers who have to oblige to do medevac for them. So that's just one I wanted to add on to crew change, seafarers and crew change. I think the protocol or the framework that ICS put in place actually is very helpful. So when I thought to bring about what Bob earlier mentioned, that you need the international organization to talk to each other, and within the country, the different agencies to talk to each other. I wanted to add an additional element, which is that the government and the industry can actually work together to bring this forward. Let me share Singapore's experience. When we know that crew change is high on the agenda because of the feedback from the industry, from ICS, from IMO as well. And what we did was actually, it was a very laborious, intensive interagency exercise. We actually brought together Ministry of Health, ICA, our Immigration Customs Authority. We also brought together our Ministry of Transport and including our Aviation Authority, where we basically looked at the framework that's developed by ICS and the feedback from the industry and developed what we call this guidebook and handbook, which SSA has put forth. And this guidebook actually lays out very detailed protocol, which we have gone through as well. And they are largely in line with the industry's guidelines that are promulgated by the IMO. And with this guidebook, I think it will help industry players to actually better plan, because now the process is there. It's just how do you plan, right? The second question, I think, comment which Simon raised, it is a pertinent one. What we are looking at is how, in terms of in terms of a pandemic situation, how do you balance, right, between public health risks as well as the ability to facilitate and ensure there's efficiency in the crew change. Therefore, there needs to be in place procedures and protocol to be able to balance that needs on the both national and international level. And one of which I think that once the flights resume and travel restrictions are gradually being lifted, as with any activities, while we cannot expect to resume back to pre-19 levels, we can expect greater crew change. And with this protocol in place, and as countries start to adopt a more elaborate process to explain to the industry what are the steps to be taken, industry can also plan ahead. The reason why we needed the direct vessel to plane and plane to vessel is because in a way we are trying to also balance between the health needs of Singapore, and also I think it helps to safeguard the seafarers that go on board the ship, that there is minimal interaction, and it allows also shipping companies to be assured, right, that when your seafarers go on board the ship, they are actually in a good health condition, because anything that goes beyond that will have downstream effect in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, 1 month's time, 2 months' time, not just to the shipping companies in terms of losses and delays, but also to port authorities who have to handle more COVID cases. So on that, we seek the industry's understanding, but there are creative solutions. There are creative solutions. So some of our conversation with the Singapore Shipping Association, you know, putting in place floating holding facilities has been quite forthcoming and constructive. We are also talking about having chartered flights with industries, and we've gotten all our agencies involved to make that happen. So whether it's from countries, for example, which doesn't have flights out, or countries where we have some limited flights, but how do we make it work? So I would like to layer Bob's point on IOs talking to each other, within the country, agencies talking to each other. I thought in Singapore, having that Maritime Singapore ecosystem and having that frequent interaction with our industry players has been very, very helpful, where we can talk candidly with each other and see how we we can move forward on it. At last but not least, I thought I'm quite heartened actually to see you have industry-driven actions where we see crew changes by ships themselves, for example, to send their crew members back and to charter flights. And that is actually another very brilliant move by the industry. So I think I see it as an effort where all parties have to come in and do our bit. It could result in a little bit of delay, but I guess is how do we work together in times of constraints like that? We have to give and take. Yeah.
Lee Hoon, are you saying that there's no gap in the law and that if a ship has sick passengers, it has a right to enter the nearest port and seek medical help? Are you saying that?
There are international conventions which require port authorities to extend help. Whether the maritime authorities or the government implement, which is what Simon mentioned, is a separate issue. So, for example, if we have a ship out there who actually issued a SOS, and if it's in our maritime search and rescue region, Singapore is obliged to send a helicopter. And we have gotten our RSAF, for example, in the past to do such medevac. Perhaps, Prof, your question is for cruise ships, for example, where there are no medical situation, and if you make a scheduled call, and you're supposed to call on a port, and this is what happened, right? Not just in Asia, but basically we saw in Australia, in the European areas, continents as well. Is there an obligation for the crews to call on the port? Then that, I think there probably isn't any, I'm not a lawyer, sorry, but there probably isn't any international law on that. It will then depend on the commercial and government negotiation.
I want to ask Bob for help. Bob, the way I understand the law now, there is no law at the moment which obligates a port to allow a ship with sick passengers to enter it to seek medical help. Am I right or not?
Well, I think there's a law that requires the port state to provide medical assistance. Now, it might do that by sending doctors to the ship or a helicopter. The difficulty becomes, what if it's a cruise vessel with several thousand passengers and you think several hundred could be infected? Then you have a very serious problem because the port state might not have the medical facilities. It could be a massive expense and it's not clear who's going to pay for it. This is why I think we need a convention that deals with cruise ships and the safety not only of the passengers on the ship, but the seafarers or the crew members on the ship, and that protocols are developed and the liabilities. It's not just for governments to work out. They have to be working very closely with industry to have protocols to know who is going to come forward and pay, in the same way that the shipping companies will pay for charter flights to send seafarers home. We have to figure out what is going to happen when there's a pandemic and cruise liners are involved. And I think we need new rules rather than worry about whether we can make a legal argument under a given convention now. I think we need protocols to address the issue in cooperation between the flag state, the port state, the ship operator, the ship owner, and the port and the coastal authorities.
We are running out of time. Before I call on Bob to summarize the discussion, I want to put one more question to the panel. During the pandemic, many ships are idle and are anchored or at dockside. Two NUS colleagues have asked me to draw the panel's attention to the potential rise of the spread of non-indigenous species. Ships being anchored for a long time facilitate upsurge of biofouling of the ship's vessel, of the ship's hull. When global ship traffic eventually starts to move again, the ship become a vector for the spread of alien organisms. Will the panel have a comment on this?
Professor?
Koji, please, Koji.
Thank you. And I think this is a true concern and should be discussed. But this matter should be discussed at MEPC of IMO in the context of implementation of Ballast Water Management Convention. When pandemic is over, we will handle it. It is not sort of problem continue to exist, but this is a present problem and could be resolved soon. But while on this floor, the Search and Rescue Convention is an important convention for an IMO. And there is a provisions to provide help. But the problem is when vessel come to the port, vessel itself doesn't have any problem, proceeds to the port, and then passengers or crew have a problem. And this is not an accident or any incident of ship. So therefore, we need to handle in a different way. Well, because of the time, probably I may stop.
Lei Hoon, do you have a brief comment on this question of biofouling of ships?
Yeah, I understand for biofouling, indeed there's the IMO guidelines on management of biofouling and the Ballast Water Convention that came into force in 2017. So it could be something that's taken up in these two convention and the guidelines, whether it can be enhanced further. But specifically for Singapore, because our port is still operating, the ships continue to come and go. So we do not see a particular trend of ships wanting to stay here longer than say 3 days, 5 days, because our port dues also increase. So, and we don't encourage long stays.
Thank you, Lei Hoon. I think Koji's answer is a good one. We should take it up in MEPC at IMO. We have only 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask Bob to do the mission impossible, sum up this very rich discussion. Bob, over to you.
Okay, I had prepared some points, but I think most of them are almost out the window at this point. Let me make some sort of rather than trying to summarize exactly what has been transpired, let me try to perhaps describe some general themes which I see as taken place here in the discussion. One is that it seems clear that there are either no binding rules on states on how to deal with ships calling out their ports, or if there are rules, there's no clear protocols which port states are following, setting out their rights and obligations at port states with respect to seafarers and in some cases passengers aboard the ship. I think there's been agreement among these speakers that new protocols and perhaps new rules under the with leadership of the IMO are required. And as somebody who teaches a course in international regulation of shipping, I always say one of the drivers of when the IMO was able to operate is the IMO reacts to disasters. And in this sense, the pandemic is a disaster, which I expect the IMO will be able to come up and address by working not only with the other agencies or international institutions like WHO and the ILO, but also critically important that they work with industry. The second point is I anticipate that following the leadership of the ICS and industry in developing sort of draft protocols, following the example of Singapore that's now come up with a guidebook, I expect that there's going to be more action at the IMO and among port state control organizations to develop protocols to address the problem of seafarers, not only in getting medical assistance, but for the issue of crew changes. Third issue, I guess, that we haven't been developed too much in the discussion would be to the extent to which we're looking at perhaps a new normal. Some of the points that Hoon has brought out in terms of increased digitalization in the shipping industry. I think that is going to come. We're going to be dealing with, in effect, autonomous ships delivering containers to the new port at Quah, and perhaps with no human interaction between people on the ship and people on the shore, because it's all going to be handled by through artificial intelligence and so on. So I think that is coming as well. I think we also, the final point I'd make is we must look at this pandemic as one of what I call low probability, high consequence events. It's very little chance it's going to happen, but if it does, it has terrible consequences for everyone concerned. The only way to address those issues is to develop procedures for emergency preparedness and response, both at the international level with protocols, but also at the national and regional levels to be able to deal with the fallout. And I think this again is going to come perhaps with the leadership of the IMO and its committees dealing with the fact of, especially when it comes to cruise ships, how do you deal with the threat of a pandemic when there's thousands of people aboard a ship? How do you allocate the responsibilities of the industry and the port states and the flag states and so on? So I think those are I thought, in my view, the major themes. It's very clear that IMO is going to have to take the lead. And my worry that, coming back to a point Simon raised, is that the IMO's agenda for the next year, or this year, has been greenhouse gas emissions. There is some fear that the pandemic in dealing with COVID-19 and its aftermath might perhaps overtake the greenhouse gas emissions as a major issue on the agenda, but hopefully they will be able to deal with both of these issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that very good summation. I will now turn over to Sue.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ko. Thank you to our eminent panel for this wide-ranging discussion that also turned the light on tackling some very challenging questions and showing concern for humane concerns for people in the international shipping industry. So it leaves me now just to thank our audience for staying with us for this 90 minutes. If you enjoyed this session, do check out our Center for International Law website for information on our future events, as well as recordings of our past conferences. Thank you very much, and goodbye.